In this chapter, we'll look at the effects of camera height. It's a common notion that placing the camera lower makes a character look big or superior, and placing the camera higher makes the character look small or inferior. That's generally true, at least when we're around eye level. Placing the camera much lower, we understand it as being low, so we don't perceive him as necessarily being big, but instead perceive it as a creative choice. Shooting down on characters, we understand our higher vantage point, so it doesn't make them look small. Instead, being higher up causes us to detach from the scene. In this angle, we're completely aloof. Let's look at a couple of important considerations when choosing a camera height. The first is that if the set doesn't have a ceiling, it's very easy to shoot off the edge of the set. If we planned a shot like this, but not asked for a ceiling, it's too late to put one in. Here, one solution is to shoot it where the ceiling is not an issue, maybe closer to a wall. We're looking at this because shooting upwards can produce problems that don't show up until the last minute, so we need to plan ahead. When we're outdoors, exposure is an issue. Shooting against the sky, which is much brighter, it's very hard to get good exposure on the character. If we expose for him, the sky burns out completely. If we put more light on him to balance the exposure, he can have trouble keeping his eyes open. Here we may want to shoot it in front of something less bright or something we can control, which of course is easier to find if we stay at eye level. Secondly, we need a reference to really know that we're high or low. Here we're above eye level. As we move to waist level, the perspective change on the man himself is unremarkable, and we're actually judging our height by the position of the far wall. As soon as we put in something to cause perspective lines, we get a much clearer idea of our height. Moving back to eye level, the perspective tells us much more than the elevation itself, so the more perspective we can create, the more we get out of choosing a height. Another way to bring in a reference is with foreground. As soon as we put the woman in the foreground, our height is 10 times as clear. As we move to around eye level, the thing to notice is that the man looks virtually the same, so we're getting our height from the foreground. Here we're at waist level. It's not until we're very low that the perspective on the man himself is noticeably different. Here the foreground and the leaning lines together create very powerful perspective. One last way to judge our height is by the horizon line if we have one. If we're looking up on her, the horizon line will be lower in the frame. If we're looking down on her, the horizon line will be higher. The effect of this is that when the horizon line is above the eye, she appears submersed or suppressed. When the horizon line is below the eye, she looks freer and more in command. In choosing a camera height, eye level is naturally most like reality. But it also produces very ordinary and documentary images, so that in itself can be reason to stay away from eye level. But if we're at eye level, we're also always tilting downwards. Here we're at pure eye level, but in order to put our eyes higher in the frame, we have to tilt down a little. So seen from the side, we're shooting downwards. In order to more naturally place our eyes higher in the frame, we should be lower and more level. So let's nudge a little under eye level. In this over the shoulder, we're again at eye level angled downwards. But let's again center a little lower, placing us beneath eye level. The further we get away from the characters, the more we should gravitate towards waist level. Here again, eye level produces a very objective framing. Being lower relaxes the perspective, which creates a more filmic image and also makes more sense to a theater audience which is seated lower than the screen. Finally, it can be effective to adjust for the perspective lines that go from eye to eye and chin to chin. If we nudge a little lower, the perspective leads more elegantly from face to face. Staging upwards and downwards is really the same as staging with level characters, except that we need to make choices about camera height. We could just go ahead and shoot by the eye line as usual. This results in shooting hard down on one character and hard up on the other, which makes one character look superior and the other inferior. The completely neutral way of shooting this is to simply level each camera with the character. Leveling with the characters is more relaxed to look at and gives them equal power. But it puts us further away from the eye line and further outside the dialogue. The way to get a little bit of both is to place the camera halfway in between eye line and level. This lets us be part of the dialogue without having to do hard angles. Perhaps even more useful in close shots, it allows us to be fairly close to the eye line without making one character superior to the other. There's nothing that stops us from mixing heights. Here we're shooting hard up on the man, but we're level on the woman, so she seems relaxed and detached from the conversation, while he takes it more personally. Here we're shooting level on the man, but down on the woman and close to the eye line, so she's more directly affected, while he's more detached. Most people are familiar with the line, or the 180-degree rule, so let's look at it for the record. Simply put, once we pick a side of the action to be on, all cameras to cover that action need to be on that side. The line can be the eye line, but not necessarily. Here one character is facing away, so the eye line doesn't apply. Instead, we'll say that the line is created by attention, either between characters or between characters and objects. Honoring the line is essential to maintaining the understanding of scene geography that's created in the viewer's mind when we cut between shots, and it's a rule that it almost never works to break. So let's look at what happens if we do it wrong. We'll put one of the cameras on the other side so that we're jumping the line every time we cut. Starting in this camera, we're fine, but as we cut to the other camera, the characters are flipping positions and we've lost all orientation. Expecting action to be covered from the same side is so ingrained for all of us that one of the only uses for jumping the line is to deliberately trick the audience. Here the woman hears someone by the door, so her attention goes in that direction, putting the line here. We'll then set up another camera on the other side to cover the man walking over. As the woman looks, we're expecting the man to be entering from the left. But as we pan with him over to the woman, finding ourselves on the other side of the line is startling. With only a couple of characters and no movement, it's easy enough to know which side of the line we're on. So let's turn up the heat to see why line management is so important. In this scene, which is not unrealistic, we have a lot of dialogue crisscrossing the scene, as well as several characters moving around. First, the red man talks to the blue woman, so we'll put in two cameras on this side of the line. Then he talks to the red woman, so we'll put in two cameras here. Where in this camera as he walks to the red woman, so this camera is now on the wrong side of the line. As the man in the suit joins the conversation, the cameras we put in for that have to be on the side we're already on. Where in this camera as the red man turns his attention to the blue woman, so staying on the same side we're currently on will create an internal reverse on her. As she turns her attention to the man in the suit, this camera's still good. And these cameras just became valid again. But we can't cut to any of these cameras. As we go on, we have more and more lines to be aware of, and each line decides which cameras we can and can't cut to. As we add moving cameras to the equation, the scene can potentially become uncuttable unless we develop a keen awareness of where the line is at all times. We need to be able to solve situations like this at the snap of a finger, so we'll work quite heavily with line management on these first two volumes. For now, let's take a quick look at the major techniques for managing the line and then cover them later in more detail. The first important distinction is that the only problem is cutting across the line. It's fine to cross the line as long as we see it happening. There are really only two ways to see a line cross happening, either by moving the characters or by moving the camera. As the man walks, he takes the line with him and the line crosses us. Most character movement forces line crosses, which in turn decides where other cameras need to be, so unless the scene is extremely simple, this is something we need to deal with. The other way is by camera movement. Anytime we do a camera move, it's very likely that we cross a line in the process. Here we're simply tracking across the line. It's important to be aware of which side of the line we end up on, because it would be impossible to cut to any camera on the other side afterwards. Often both happen at the same time. As we track with a man over to a right-angle master, he causes a line cross as well as us. Or here, as the woman walks to a new mark, we help with a line cross by nudging in the other direction. An important technique that allows us to cut across the line is called hinging. In this scene, we have two sets of dialogue, first between the man and the blue woman, which is covered in these two matching reverses, and second between the man and the red woman, which is covered in these two reverses. We can't just cut between the cameras at random. If we're cutting dialogue between these two cameras, cutting to this one would cross the line. So to activate the other line, we hinge the cutting on the camera for the new dialogue that's already on our current side of the line. Now on the other line, we can cut to the reverse. To get back, we again go through the hinge camera and we're free to cut to either camera on the original line. The hinge camera is our bridge to the other line, and we need to go through it to get back and forth. Here we've been cutting between the man and the blue woman. As we cut to the hinge camera, we activate the other line, and then travel out the line to the reverse. We then go back into the hinge camera and hinge back onto the original line. A less useful but still noteworthy way of cutting across the line is to cut through a camera that's placed exactly on the line. As soon as we're directly on the line, we've lost any reference to which side we were on, so either of these cameras is a good cut. Starting to the left, we cut to the camera exactly on the line. Since we're now neutral, we can cut to any camera. A distinction that perhaps goes without saying is that we only need to manage the line within the scene. If we're on this side, and then cut away to a different scene, when we return, we're free to start on either side of the line, but then of course have to stick to that side. Besides using these techniques, the easiest way to make line management simpler is to clean up as much as possible before we even get started. The first way to do that is to filter out the characters we don't care about. As soon as the view is less cluttered, it becomes much easier to keep track of which lines we need to be concerned with, and it's usually fewer than it looked like before. The second way is to decide on a major coverage angle. If we don't do that, we'll basically have to put in cameras for every position of every line throughout the scene. Deciding to generally cover the scene in this direction increases the likelihood of a camera staying useful as the line moves around. The extreme of this is sitcom or soap opera blocking, where all cameras are outside the scene and pointed in more or less the same direction, which of course is not our goal. But first deciding on a general shooting direction is much easier to build from. Getting coverage is the process of putting in cameras for everything we're interested in or might be interested in when editing. The simplest form of coverage is to start a scene in a master to establish geography and then put in cameras for everything we know or suspect we'll need in editing. Here we're covering the characters, but we could also pick shots for the phone, for body language, or for any other part of the scene. Starting in the master, every subsequent cut is really an insert on part of the scene. As we cut between the characters, we're depending more or less on the scene geography we got from the master. If we hadn't done a master, their locations and relationships could be hard to work out. But covering a scene as inserts of a master can make a scene seem more stitched together and less fluid. Still, it's a very normal way to get coverage, though perhaps not the most interesting. The step up from this is to add 2 shots, 3 shots, and reverses to get variety and to quickly shift perspective or scale to the parts of the scene that are interesting or important at the moment. But as we start doing combinations like this, it's clear that we could easily cover the scene in 100 cameras, at the same time wearing down the actors and shooting rolls and rolls of film we'll never use. So let's look at some tools to narrow down the choices. In placing cameras for dialogue, the number of cameras we need first of all depends on the length of the scene. If the scene is long, we need more shot sizes to keep it interesting and to tell a story in editing. If it's short, we can get away with only a couple, and having lots of shot sizes can actually be distracting. It's a common conception that reverse shots have to match. But this is really an unnecessary creative limitation, so let's take complete liberty in staging this scene. We'll start by leaving one external reverse intact, but placing the other one much lower. You be the judge of what it means. Perhaps that the further distance from the eye line gives us a more secret and individual angle on him, but it cuts just as well. Here we're normal on the man, but we're at a right angle on the woman, so the shot on her is further away from the eye line and more separate. Here we're again in a low angle in this reverse, and behind the man's shoulder in this reverse. The point is that getting perfect matching angles is not necessarily a big deal, and this can help us save some cameras. If we make it a goal that instead of covering every possible combination, we select fewer shots that capture more of the action, the coverage is not only more optimized, it's easier to deal with. Here we could easily cover the scene in 10 to 15 cameras. Let's instead place 4 cameras, first an internal reverse on the blue man, then an external reverse on the red woman, a shot that frames the blue man with the man in the suit, and a shot that frames the two women. This is extremely compact staging. The shots aren't framed ideally, quote unquote, but there's plenty of coverage to cut a scene from, and there's more information in each shot, so the cameras stay interesting for longer. For a close-up on the red woman, we're using this shot, which serves double duty for later. To include the man in the suit, we're keeping the blue man in the foreground as well. For the blue woman's dialogue, we're using the same shot as before, keeping the red woman in the foreground. The scene cuts just as easily as if we were covering it by the book, and it might in fact be more interesting. A powerful way to select shots is by grouping characters to emphasize relationships. By grouping, we show who's together and who's not, which brings meaning to the coverage. In this scene, we're in a negotiation. The man in the suit is a businessman. The blue characters are a married couple. The red man is the attorney for the businessman, and the red woman is attorney for the couple. Since we're in a negotiation, that first of all creates two very clear groups made up of each team on opposite sides of the negotiating table. So let's start by framing one camera for the businessman and his attorney, and another for the couple and their attorney. Cutting between them, we show the members of each group together in that group and opposite the others. Every shot can be a different grouping of the same characters. If we want to show the couple as a unit, we'll make them into a group for this shot. If the blue woman and the attorney have a small exchange, we'll make that into a group as well. Grouping characters together shows relationship, whether it's a positive or a negative one. Let's say that during the negotiation, the businessman begins revealing a secret he knows about the blue woman. That creates a relationship here, which we'll cover in two over the shoulders. The blue man is disheartened to hear the truth, so let's create a shot to group him by himself. Let's create another single shot on the businessman as he enjoys his victory. Grouping to show relationships is not a law, because sometimes we just want a three-shot if that's where the action is. But it can be a helpful and quick way to get meaningful coverage in fewer cameras. After the opening, we'll cut between the group on the couple and the group on the businessman. At some point, the blue woman consults the attorney. Meanwhile, the businessman and the blue man continue the negotiation. The blue woman comes back with a remark. The businessman then turns his attention to her and begins revealing a secret she hasn't told her husband about. We go back and forth for a while. The couple's attorney objects, but the truth is out, and we cut to the blue man as he takes it in. We cut to the businessman as he enjoys his victory. We could go on and create as many relationships as we need, maybe some bickering between the attorneys. But the important thing is that instead of having covered the scene from every conceivable angle and hoping to work out the meaning later, we've chosen the meaning going in. We don't cover everything, and we don't need to. Spatial continuity is the technical name for the understanding of the scene's layout that's created in the viewer's mind when we cut between shots. From the various cameras that make up the coverage, the viewer depends on being able to mentally stitch the scene together. Here, the two shots glue together and create the illusion of continuous space, with the woman to the left and the man to the right. But in this case, the choice of angles made us construct the wrong mental model of the scene. The characters are really seated back to back. So let's look at some ways to create spatial continuity. The easiest way is to start in a master. Coming from a complete overview of the scene, the geography is so clear that it almost doesn't matter what we do afterwards. We can sometimes even cross the line. That's the classic reason for starting a scene in a master, but starting in a master has some significant drawbacks which we'll look at in the next chapter. Honoring the line can by itself be enough for the spatial orientation to make sense. When we cut to different cameras on this side, it only takes a moment to deduct from our mental model where we've moved to. So let's look a little more closely at why the line works. No matter where we place cameras on this side, the red man will always be to the left and the blue woman will always be to the right. Even cutting between tied over the shoulders where our angle is changing nearly 180 degrees, the man is to the left and the woman is to the right. So the mental model is really made up of knowing what's to the left and right. The problem is that if we're suddenly on the other side of the line, the man is now to the right and the woman to the left. In the few seconds it takes us to rotate our model and figure out where we are, we're not paying attention to the story and we experience a distracting jolt. But in the first example, we were honoring the line, yet we still misunderstood the geography. The reason is that we were keeping the space in front of the characters even though they were seated back to back. We've come to automatically expect the space in the shot to be part of the shared space between the characters, and since we didn't know better, this led us to assume that they were sitting in front of each other. If we instead frame the shots like this, the space really is the shared space, and the scene makes perfect sense without any other aids. An effective way to maintain spatial continuity is to create overlapping groups. Here we'll create one shot that groups the man and the red woman, and another that groups the red man and the blue woman. When the shots we pick contain elements that are visible in other shots as well, it's very easy to mentally piece together the scene. This is called pivoting because the editing revolves around a character or an object. Here we're using the plan as a pivot, so it's visible both in this shot and in this shot. And again as we cut to the woman in the middle. So the layout of the scene is reasonably clear. Here we're pivoting on characters in the background. With reference in the first shot, it's fairly easy to deduct where we are in the second. Hopefully we concluded that the characters are staged like this. In this scene, we'll again forgo a master and first pivot around the blue man to this shot. Then pivot around the woman to this shot, and then to this shot. As we play through it again, even though we're zigzagging through the scene, the layout is clear because one character is always the common denominator. It works the same backwards. With no other references in the scene, the spatial continuity is coming directly from the pivoting. Depending on how we place the cameras, pivots behave in two very different ways that are important to recognize. When we're pivoting around an object or a character in the middle, that object will jump from side to side in the frame. Here the object is an inconspicuous plant, but if it were a large object, it could get annoying. Here we're pivoting around the character in the middle. He also jumps from side to side, but since we're clearly going between two groups, it seems to happen for a reason. When we're rotating around a character, we're more inclined to keep him in the same part of the frame. Here the blue man stays on the right side. Here the woman stays on the left side. When we have the choice, it's better to have the character stay in the same part of the frame because it takes less effort to make sense of. Returning to the discussion on hinging, a hinge is nearly always also a pivot. Starting on the first line, as we hinge onto the second line, the man stays in the same part of the frame. After having traveled out the second line, we're back in the hinge camera. As we hinge back on the first line, we again pivot around the man. On our way back, the line is here, so pivoting into this camera is technically a line cross. However, since we're pivoting on the man, the cut is smooth enough that it really doesn't matter. One of the most powerful ways to make a scene interesting is to control the order information is presented in. To do that, let's first look at the concept of open and closed framings. An open framing is a framing where we don't have everything we need to understand what we're seeing. The real story, the key information, lies outside the boundaries of the frame, and we're only seeing a small part of the bigger picture. That immediately makes us ask questions like, where are we?